Okay, well, here is my welcome. My name is Annegret Dietweiler Dansbeck-Gruber. I'm a neuroscientist at the Neuroscience Institute and at Princeton University, where I have conducted my research in traumatic brain injury for the past 10 years, at first over the whole spectrum of traumatic brain injury, and for the last 5 years I have made a concentration among other studies on sports-related concussion. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, which is co-sponsored by the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey and the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs and the Neuroscience Institute of Princeton University. Taking a brief historic perspective, it seems that sports have gone through ups and downs in sort of a cyclical fashion with regard to how aggressively the sports are played. And in the spirit of the Woodrow Wilson School, I would like to open this event with a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, which is made during his presidency in the early 20th century. And what's interesting is his kind of note, he was a big sports supporter and advocate. And I actually found out as I looked more into it that he boxed while he was at Harvard. I was very surprised about that. So during his presidency, physical injuries apparently peaked. And obviously that was of concern to him. And he decided to call the coaches the football coaches at that point in time, into the White House and urge them, gentlemen, please, let's change the rules of game before public policy change, before public opinion changes. I think this is kind of an interesting leitmotif that he coined in his time that would apply to a certain degree or might apply to a certain degree to what is happening now, only with the difference that we're very preoccupied with a different type of injury which is much less visible. It's sports-related concussion, or concussion in general, obviously, is a very elusive injury. It's not easily recognized by an unschooled eye. Obviously, people who have seen lots of concussions will recognize them very quickly. But in general, it is something that is not jumping at anyone's and can be easily masked by the player. So this is obviously somewhat raises its complexities. The reason why our attention is now more drawn to that is probably because we have a technology that allows us to look into the in vivo brain, that allows us to understand better what is going on in the brain, which obviously didn't exist in this time. So was it that in the early 20th century when athletes died or were seriously dysfunctional, the concussive injury was simply not recognized? So so we are presented now with this injury that we know much more about it. We can capture it in the research setting from a neuroimaging point of view. We cannot yet capture it in the clinical setting with an MRI or a CAT scan, but we have advanced neuroimaging techniques that allow us to see the injury. Obviously, the clinical skills of clinicians have improved as well. And there's definitely a higher awareness in schools, etc. However, why is it that we still have a lot of these terrible concussive injuries happening, especially second impact syndromes, that with this greater knowledge should not happen? There was just another case at Ramapo College a few days ago who got injured last week, continued to play, and then collapsed after a game just 3 days ago and had went into seizure, major seizure, and had to be hospitalized. This is something that should be avoided. It should not be happening. So somewhere, science has moved ahead, but it's not necessarily translated into the clinical setting, into the concussion programs that are emerging everywhere. But on what are they based? Are they really based on the latest scientific evidence? Is this translated? I think that's where we have this grayish area that we need to address. And hopefully tonight, by covering this topic from a multidisciplinary approach, we can raise questions and hopefully set something underway to help this situation. So we will look at it from a genetics point of view and the long-term effects, the role that clinicians should play, are playing, the role of media, the role of advocacy out in the football field, in the sports scene, and also from an educational prevention perspective, and finally from a public policy point of view. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Barbara Geiger-Parker, who is President and CEO of the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. She has been in this position for 27 years. She has had the opportunity to develop the community-based services of the organization to better meet the needs of individuals with brain injury, members of their families, and allied health professionals. She has grown the organization from a staff of 4 to a staff of 25 and increased the budget tenfold. Among her accomplishments is establishing through legislation the TBI Fund, which is a payer of last resort for rehabilitation services needed by people with brain injury. In 2012, Mrs. Geiger-Parker led the effort to establish the United States Brain Injury Alliance as its founding board chair. The alliance is comprised of 21 statewide brain injury organizations from all regions of the United States. The member states contain close to 100,000 people and represent slightly more than 30% of the population according to the 2010 census. The mission of the United States Brain Injury Alliance is to engage the community in preventing brain injuries and improve lives through awareness, prevention, advocacy, support, research, and community engagement. Ms. Geiger-Parker has previous experience in managing survey research projects at Rutgers University Eagleton Institute of Politics. That's enough? Okay. Please join me in welcoming Barbara.
I'm very pleased to be here this evening. Can you hear me? Okay. To bring greetings from the board, staff, and volunteers of the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. The chairman of our board, Wally Kyle, is here today, and I hope you've had an opportunity to meet some of our other board members, members of our terrific staff, and committee members who have worked on this concussion issue with our alliance for more than a decade. It is an honor to be here at the Woodrow Wilson School of International and Public Policy at Princeton University. I would like to thank the school for its generous co-sponsoring of this concussion event. Special thanks are due to Dr. Annegret Detweiler, who not only helped to design tonight's program, but she and her Princeton colleagues have taken care of accommodations and logistics for our meeting. The idea for tonight took root at a lunch table at the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey's seminar this May. Those seated around the table included Dr. Detweiler, Dr. Jill Brooks, Peter Keating, Wally Kyle, who's up there in the audience, and staff member Joanna Boyd, whom many of you had an opportunity to meet. So in 4 short months, and over the summer, I want to point out, this small group, assisted by Renee Carfey of our staff, put together a program that consists of excerpts and experts. Excerpts from the League of Denial film, and then the experts that you see before you. I would like to thank the program planners for their dedication to not only helping young athletes address concussion, but also helping the rest of us understand more about concussion. Thank you. So in closing, I'd like to thank our panelists for both their work in addressing sports-related concussions and their willingness to be here this evening to share their findings and impressions with us. Thanks also to Partners for Health, which is a local foundation serving the Montclair, New Jersey area that has supported our work, and also the Department of Human Services, Division of Disability Services, Traumatic Brain Injury Fund, which also provided some funding for tonight. Thanks.
Okay, so it's now a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marco Putukian, who is the Director of Athletic Medicine and Head Team Physician at Princeton University. She received her bachelor's degree from Yale University and her MD from Boston University. She is board certified in internal medicine and sports medicine. Marco has a past president of the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine and is a team physician for US soccer as well as US men's lacrosse team. Dr. Putukian has been an author and co-author of several articles, including the NATA and AMSSM position statements on concussion, several team physician consensus statements, and the two most recent Zurich International Concussion Conferences. She is on the NCAA Task Force on Concussion, chairs the US Lacrosse Sports Science and Safety Committee, serves on the USA Football Medical Advisory Committee, and also currently serves on the NFL's Head, Neck, and Spine Committee, chairing the Return to Play Committee. So join me in welcoming Dr. Putukian, and she will speak from a team physician's point of view.
I want to thank, first of all, Annegret and Barbara for the invitation to speak. It's really an honor for me to speak on this topic and present to you a team physician's perspective. I initially became involved and interested in the injury of concussion when I started my work as a team physician at Penn State and saw a couple of really interesting concussions. And it was fascinating to me to have an athlete in front of me who would perseverate and ask the same questions again and again, like, how did I get hurt? Did I walk off the field? Did you call my parents? And then 5 minutes later, the same questions, and yet have complete normal CAT scans and other things. So that's how I initially became interested in concussion. As Annegret mentioned, it's an elusive injury. There's no clear marker. You can't get an x-ray like this gentleman here on crutches, and there's a significant variability in the presentation. Oftentimes, the signs and symptoms may be delayed. And what we do on the sideline has limitations. So we can try to evaluate these injuries, but oftentimes there's significant limitations in terms of our ability to diagnose them. In terms of tracking recovery and return to play, it's really an individualized one. It's not, they're all different. And I think that's one of the things that's quite challenging for our athletes as well as our coaches and our parents. There are a lot of guidelines out there, and the definition of concussion, the assessment, and the management are really all evolving, and I think that's also challenging for many of us. I spend a fair bit of my time de-educating athletes, telling them that things that they've heard from somewhere else aren't necessarily true, and I think my colleagues would say the same thing. And now, with all the advent of marketing, there's a lot of money to be had, there's new gadgets coming out left and right. It's sometimes hard to kind of sort through the weeds, at least as a physician. Annegret mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, and this is the flying wedge. This is football back before 1905, and they didn't. You note that they don't have helmets, and then that actually the flying wedge and Teddy Roosevelt's concerns is what formed the NCAA. And then, as you know, things changed. We had the development of some helmets. And Then there's been more recently a lot of concerns. Does football have a future? And then this article that was written by by Mr. Keating, in terms of the scientists that are fighting over the brains, and that's where we've come to in the last several years. The guidelines I mentioned, there's several of them. There are many different people that sort of looked at this question in terms of sport-related concussion, and it's really a plethora of information to sort through as a clinician or as an athletic trainer trying to take care of this injury. One of the problems is definition. So one of the definitions is mental status changes after a blow to the head or body. And that means, a loss of consciousness or an alteration in terms of memory or confusion or disorientation. And the concussion sport definition, which came out of Zurich, where you can it's basically defined as a pathophysiologic process that affects the brain, and it can be brought on by either direct trauma or an impulsive blow. A typically rapid onset of symptoms that are short-lived, and they define it as a functional injury because some of the typical or the standard structural imaging is normal. We'll talk more about that later. But with this definition, all you need is symptoms, okay? And if you look at the number of symptoms that are here, many of these are not specific to concussion, right? Headache, nausea, neck pain. We have meningitis on campus. It could be that, right? What about someone that feels dizzy or lightheaded? That can be cardiac. So these symptoms themselves are not necessarily specific to concussion, only making it more challenging. What we do know is that certainly the incidence is increasing, whether it's because we as physicians and athletic trainers are better at detecting it, whether our athletes are stronger or bigger, they hit harder, they're more aggressive, or because of the media attention that's been addressed. I mean, I think it's fortunate that we're really addressing this issue as we are. It's not just football, right? When you look at the sports, this is the NCAA's data, and you can see that it's football is the highest incidence, but right behind it is men's lacrosse and women's ice hockey. So I mean, there are a lot of sports that we have to think about, and at the high school level, it's the same, right? So there's a lot of different sports, and both genders are represented. Again, and it's sometimes people ask about helmets or no helmets, but when you think about some of these sports that are non-helmeted, like wrestling, or like basketball, or like soccer, we see concussions, and the same as we see in our helmeted sports. I was recently in a think tank in New York, and with the NFL and FIFA, and Michael Turner from the Equestrians told us that we're all wimps. 50 times amount of concussions in equestrian compared to the NFL. 50 times. So this is an issue for not just football. This is a lot of different issues. What about gender differences? When I was going through school, I remember seeing that picture on the left, run like a girl, and now, it's kind of cool to throw like a girl, right? But as it relates to concussion, there are gender differences. In the sports that have the same rules, we see an increased reported incidence of concussion in women compared to men. And why that is unclear, whether they report more or whether there may be differences in terms of the strength or the size of the neck, and I think we'll have someone talking about that later. In terms of the sideline evaluation, again, I'll spend most of my day tomorrow on a soccer field and then on a football field. And a lot of times, there'll be an athlete that you'll want to evaluate. And the sideline evaluation has improved. This is, a way to try to standardize the approach to the assessment on the sideline, where you're looking at symptoms, where you're evaluating for more serious brain injury, where you're trying to look for a sort of a cognitive evaluation in terms of immediate memory and recall, and then looking for balance. And those things, again, as part of a standardized format. In terms of return to play, again, this is an individualized situation. We want the athlete to return to their baseline level of symptoms, cognitive function, and balance before they initiate any type of return to play progression. And it's really a gradual, incremental increase in both exertion as well as the risk for contact. They're all different. If you have an athlete that has symptoms for 15 minutes, that return to play progression may start in a few days. If you have, on the other hand, an athlete that has symptoms for 3 weeks, or they have other complicating factors, it may take several weeks to get them back. So it's individualized, and that, again, makes it a little bit challenging. You do need to consider some of the modifiers, such as a pre-existing history of concussion and when that occurred, whether or not they have other issues like learning disabilities or headaches or mood disorders. And they need to be able to start tolerating initially cognitive challenges as well as physical challenge before they advance to doing more sport-specific activities. We use neuropsychological testing, and I know Jill will probably talk a little bit about that, and as a way of evaluating for and actually predicting how long it may take someone to recover. But the bottom line is, if you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. They're all different, and even for the same athlete. In terms of predicting injury and outcome, there's a lot of work that's been done as it relates to biomarkers. Dr. Noble had a great review on a lot of the things that we look for. In terms of biomechanics, there's a lot of work being done now looking for that and questioning whether or not that big hit always leads to a big injury. Some other work out of North Carolina would tell you that it's not always a big hit that leads to a big injury. And genetics, right? You got to have the right genes, and again, I know that we'll be talking about that later. In terms of other innovations in research, again, we want something to help us predict injury as well as outcome, and certainly, as Dr. Detweiler will talk about, there's a lot of advanced imaging that's very useful in demonstrating abnormalities in sport-related concussion, despite normalization on other measures. And it's very exciting work, and it's been a pleasure for me to work with Annegret over the past several years. When my colleagues, a couple of publications, and they'll ask me, well, are you guys using this? Right now, I still tell you, it's really a research tool. But I hope that in the future we'll have something that's more promising in terms of not only diagnosis, but also assessing the severity of injury as well as tracking recovery. Some of the uncertainties and then the link to complications, this is certainly really ever present in everyone's mind. The concern for depression and increased suicidality, post-concussion syndrome, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We don't really understand, I think, the role of these subconcussive blows. We don't, at the same time, I do have some concerns related to some of the unexpected consequences as it relates to legislation. And oftentimes, I think there's a fair bit of myth and hype before we actually have research. At the same time, we want to do something, right? We want to act now. We don't want to wait for the answers. And that's where I think it becomes quite challenging. So certainly, the issues of CTE are out there. And for me, a lot of times they'll have athletes that come in, they'll just have one concussion, and they'll be worried about CTE, right? So they're worried. That's the elephant sitting in the living room. So policy changes, certainly there are a lot of changes that occurred back in December of '09 with the NFL. The NCAA quickly followed suit in terms of mandating a lot of best practices. That continues at the high school level. The Zach Lysett law out in Seattle, which created a lot of legislative efforts across the country and a lot of changes in rules. There's a lot of issues as it relates to media, and you see a lot of these, and a lot of times, again, I have a reaction of, I don't know if the folks that are younger probably don't remember these commercials, but I do. Where's the beef, right? You want to see the research. At least I do. At least that's the way that I'm trained. So we're trying to do some work, and again, I've got a couple of research assistants here that are helping in the audience that are helping us do some research. We need to do more. The Ivy League has done a fair bit in terms of trying to limit contact practices. The NCAA has done the same, and right now we're one of 12 schools actually as part of a prospective research study looking at concussion, but we need more, certainly. So these are the things, education and awareness, looking at technique. There's a lot of role that our coaches can play in terms of not only tackling techniques and other techniques, but also strength and conditioning. Trying to change the culture of the game. I think that's what we've tried to see in a lot of sports, not just football, but hockey and lacrosse as well. Not only changes in the rules, but also enforcing the rules that currently exist. Any athletic trainers in the room will know that there's a rule about hitting with the crown of your head in football that's never been put in place. And figuring out ways to decrease exposure. So kind of putting it all together, and this is a slide publication of Kevin Guskowitz and Mike McRae. There's a lot of issues on the left here that we can do in terms of prevention. When a concussion occurs, there's a fair amount of things on the right that we can do as we evaluate concussion, and hopefully in the end we can try to make it a safer sport. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for a great talk. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jill Brooks, who is a neuropsychologist, and she obtained her Doctor of Philosophy degree in counseling psychology at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. Dr. Brooks also worked for many years at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and in the division of neurosurgery, and then in the Department of Neurology for 9 years as a clinical neuropsychologist and associate professor of neurology. Dr. Brooks has authored numerous articles and books, chapters in the areas of neurogenic speech and language disorders, executive dysfunction, and concussion in sports. She has a particular interest in prevention of concussion in sports with primary research and clinical practice relating to education and surveillance of concussion in sports at both the high school and college levels. Dr. Brooks was instrumental in the creation of the New Jersey state law for management of concussion in sports. Jill Brooks' research in the area of concussion in female student athletes has been featured in the lay press, in ESPN magazine, on ESPN Outside the Lines, and Good Morning America, as well as locally on multiple TV and radio shows. I would also like to thank Jill for her contributions to making this happen. She actually really was the genesis of the idea to show the video clips that she will first introduce and that we're then going to show of League of Denial. And had the idea to invite two of the actors, Peter Keating and Harry Carson, whom we're still expecting. We know he's on his way and he should be here hopefully shortly. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Jill Brooks, and thank you again for her contributions. Thank you. Is this the first? Oh, no, escape. You have to put, yeah. Now here. Double click. Yeah. And then you have to make it. Okay, great.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to first thank Peter Keating from ESPN. He was the one who was able to reach out to Frontline and to the Kirk Documentary Group to ensure that we would have permission to put together clips and utilize that for you to see this evening. Otherwise, we'd be sitting for 2 hours being here watching the entire film. So thank you, Peter. And also, I'd like to thank the clip editor, Kat Holmes. She is a Princeton student, and she edited the clips and put this all together for us. So the NFL, we know, is a multi-billion-dollar company, and it presides over our national pastime. It sets the tone for public opinion, especially about what happens in the field and in the area of concussion in sports. We know that NFL football players are role models for our students, and we've seen both good and bad in the news lately. However, I'm here to say that I think that Harry Carson, who will be joining us, is probably one of the best examples of positive role models for our students and our student athletes. One thing that I wanted to point out was that on September 12th, the NFL came out with a statement estimating that nearly 1/3 of former players will develop dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or other neurological disorders such as ALS and Parkinson's disease. So we really have quite a concern here.
And what we know is that a huge number of Americans believe that sports are important to child development, and also that more needs to be done to protect the health and safety of our children. And there are millions of children, and it's estimated 51 million children in the United States, ages 6 to 17. And over 27 million of them play sports either casually or on teams, with over 16 million of them being boys and over 10.5 million being girls. But there are also millions of children that start playing sports, some of them being contact sports, before the age of 6. The CDC estimates that during the period of 2001 to 2009, that there were estimated almost 3 million student athletes under the age of 20 that were treated for sports and recreational injuries. And we know that you've already heard from Dr. Patukian that a lot of these injuries occur from not just football, but basketball and soccer. The largest being bicycling crashes, all hockey, ice hockey, playground activities, with the most dangerous sport being equestrian sports. Also, what we know about equestrian sports is that 1/3 of the injuries in equestrian sports occur to bystanders. So there are over almost 1.5 million traumatic brain injuries sustained in the United States each year. 75% of them are considered either mild traumatic brain injuries or concussions. Very timely in the news today, timely, is the cover of Time magazine. I don't know if anybody saw this, it just came out today. And it says, he died playing this game. Is football worth it? Shortly after this photo was taken, 16-year-old Chad Stover suffered a traumatic brain injury, and he never gave up. And so what we're seeing now is this trickle-down effect of information that we see not just in the NFL, but in the NHL and in our professional sports, looking at also what happens with the future of sports for our children. So what I'd like to do and have you consider before we get to the point of seeing the clips is view these clips as a jumping off point to think about the future of youth sports. Identify the teachable moments in the clips that resonate for you, and consider your role in the future when you leave here as a catalyst for change relating to concussions in youth sports. And then let's all reflect on the gestalt and looking at the big picture here in ways that we together can try and change a culture. The last thing that I'd like to say is I have a quote here from Dr. Robert Cantu, who is featured prominently in the League of Denial. And he was unable to be here with us tonight, but he gave me a quote that he asked that I read to you. He said, the finding of chronic traumatic encephalopathy in 6 deceased high school athletes should be a wake-up call. We must do better for our youth in regards to prevention and treatment of head trauma.
It's this one. No.
I can see here.
Mike was a legend and a hero. He may have been the legend and the hero because here's that blue-collar worker, the center, doesn't get any glory, doesn't catch the touchdown passes, doesn't kick the 52-yard field goal to win a game. He's just in every play.
Then, 11 years after he retired, the people of Pittsburgh received some bad news.
At what price glory, the Hall of Fame center Mike Webster died at the age of 50.
Died on Tuesday. He was just 50 years old. He was known as Iron Mike.
He
Webster ends up in the autopsy room, and the pathologist who's on call that day is this guy, Ben Amalo.
Amalo parked his car and walked into the office, and he said, "What's going on?" And one of his colleagues said, "It's Mike Webster. He's up in the autopsy room." And Amalo's response was, "Who's Mike Webster?"
And everybody looked at me like, "Where is he from? Is he from Harrisburg? Who's this guy? He doesn't know Mike Webster in Pittsburgh."
He's a Nigerian-born, incredibly well-educated guy. He doesn't know anything about football.
A doctor, Amalo was also a trained neuropathologist. From the beginning of the autopsy, Dr. Amalo could see the effects of 17 years in the football wars.
Mike looked older than he said. He looked beat up. He looked worn out. He looked drained. If I had not been told his age, I would say he looked like 70.
Webster's death certificate made Amalo suspect he may have suffered from a brain disorder.
When I opened up his skull, in my mind, I had a mental picture of what his brain would look like based on my education. I was expecting to see a brain with Alzheimer's disease features. So a shriveled, ugly-looking brain. But upon opening his skull, Mike's brain looked normal.
He didn't understand why that would be, but he became more and more curious. It became sort of like his little private mission.
Dr. Amalo wanted to fix the brain, preserve it in a chemical bath for further study.
I said, let me fix this brain. Let me spend time with this brain. There's something doesn't match. And I remember the technician challenged me, said, "What are you fixing this brain for? That brain is normal."
And Amalo becomes very firm in that moment, and he says, "Fix the brain. I want you to fix the brain."
What Amalo could not see was that hidden inside Webster's brain was evidence of a chronic disease.
And that decision would change the NFL, because if Webster's brain had not been examined, I don't honestly think that we would be where we're at today.
Hall of Fame linebacker for the New York Giants, Harry Carson, went to war with Mike Webster.
And so I have to meet force with force. All of my power is coming from my big rear end and my big thighs into my forearm, and I hit him in the face. I have to stun him, get my hands on him, throw him off when I see where the ball is going. And when I hit him in the face, his head is going back. He's going forward, but all of a sudden his head is going back and his brain is hitting up against the inside of his skull.
In football, one has to expect that almost every play, every game, every practice, they're going to be hitting their heads against each other. That's the nature of the game. Those things seem to happen around 1,000 to 1,500 times a year. Each time that happens, it's around 20 G or more. That's the equivalent to driving a car 35 miles per hour into a brick wall. 1,000 to 1,500 times per year.
On this down and dirty dance floor, huge men perform a punishing pirouette. The meek will never inherit this turf, because every play is hand-to-hand and body-to-body combat.
NFL Films captured the essence of football itself, that tension between the violence and the beauty.
But away from the glamorized hits, there was a darker side. Super Agent Lee Steinberg saw it firsthand.
I watched athletes I represented play with collapsed lungs. I watched them completely fight with doctors at every time to get into the game. I watched players deceive coaches on the sidelines when they were injured and run back into a game.
The inspiration Aikman took a knee to the head.
Stubblefield was there first. Troy Aikman took a knee to the head. You see it's right here. It's Dennis Brown coming in. You see the knee right there. Knee right on his helmet.
Aikman's concussion was bad enough that he could not return to the game. Aikman was taken to a local hospital.
I went to visit Troy. He was sitting in a darkened hospital room, all alone.
The room is dark because Aikman can't even stand looking into the light. It's, you know, it's this sort of surreal scene where the city is celebrating and the quarterback who won the game is in the hospital with his agent.
He looked at me and he said, "Lee, where am I?" And I said, "Well, you're in the hospital." And he said, "Well, why am I here?" And I said, "Because you suffered a concussion today." And he said, "Well, who did you play?" And I said, "The 49ers." And he said, "Did we win?" "Yes, you won." "Did I play well?" "Yes, you played well." What does that, and so what's that mean? It means you're going to the Super Bowl.
5 minutes later, they're sitting there, they're continuing to hang out, and Aikman suddenly turns to Steinberg and says, "What am I doing here?" And the next thing you know, they're reliving this conversation they had 5 minutes earlier.
For a minute, I thought he was joking. And I went through the same sequence of answers again. And his face brightened and we celebrated again. Maybe 10 minutes passed. And he looked at me with the same puzzled expression and asked the same sequence of questions. It terrified me to see how tender the bond was between sentient consciousness and potential dementia and confusion was.
If my knee is hurt, everyone knows it and I know it, and we can go deal with it. And shoulders, and there's only one place in your body that you really don't understand. And people always say the brain is the last frontier.
For Steinberg, there was a growing recognition of just how dangerous the sport was.
The damage was occurring every week, and I had people who I loved and cared for. And I intuitively knew that this was not just a football issue, but it was happening to football players in the pros, it was happening in college, it was happening in high school, it was happening to every player in every collision sport. So not only was it an issue for my clients, it was a huge societal issue.
NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue orchestrated the league's response.
Obviously, it's an athletic competition.
Tagliabue had begun his career as a lawyer.
People have suggested strongly to me that he picked up a lot of techniques about how to aggressively defend in things that could turn out to be class actions. And the NFL has had this strategy of going nuclear on every time it goes to court. Because the first time you ever lose, you open up the floodgates to potential billions of dollars of damage.
We don't think that...
And Tagliabue said he was skeptical about the risk from concussions, once calling the controversy the result of packed journalism.
This is the commissioner of the NFL saying that there's no concussion issue. If it was ignorance, they should have known. They should have known because the issue is so critical. That continues to be our target.
Still, Tagliabue created a scientific committee, the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, the MTBI. To lead it, he chose Elliot Pellman, the New York Jets team doctor, a firm believer that concussions were not a serious problem.
And so you had this behind the scenes, this dynamic going on, where you had a guy, Elliot Pellman, who very clearly believed that this wasn't a problem. It just wasn't a big problem for the NFL.
Most of Pellman's committee was made up of NFL loyalists. Nearly half the members were team doctors.
If you're going to put together a blue ribbon committee to study brain trauma, it should have as its chair somebody who has that as a background, either a neurologist, neurosurgeon,
CTE.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a disease, a progressive neurodegenerative disease, where the end stage leaves tau protein deposition in distinctive areas of the brain, in distinctive locations that separate this disease from any other, like Alzheimer's or some other dementia.
For some reason, the repetitive brain trauma starts this cascade of events in the brain that changes the way this tau looks and behaves. It goes awry, and it starts destroying the integrity of the brain cells.
The tau is effectively closing in around the brain cells and choking them, and it's impacting the way the brain is working and ultimately erupting in issues around memory, agitation, anger.
Romano shared his evidence with the leading brain researchers who confirmed his findings. It was the first hard evidence that playing football could cause permanent brain damage.
Certainly we knew that if you got hit on the head so many times, that maybe you had a 20% chance of having dementia pugilistica if you were a former professional boxer. But we didn't really relate that in a modern sport like football, in a helmeted sport, that it could lead to that, and that was the big discovery, I think.
Dr. Romano believed the National Football League would want to know about his discovery.
That was what I thought in my naive state of mind. But unfortunately, I was proven wrong. It wasn't meant to be that way.
In a letter to the journal Neurosurgery, Dr. Pelland and other members of the NFL's MTBI committee attacked Dr. Romano's paper.
These statements are based on a complete misunderstanding of the relevant medical literature.
They even questioned whether Mike Webster was suffering from neurological problems.
There is inadequate clinical evidence that the subject had a chronic neurological condition.
The league officials, the doctors and scientists serving on the MTBI committee, not only disputed those findings, they went after Dr. Romano with a vengeance. They publicly said he should retract his findings.
The NFL doctors insisted Dr. Romano was misunderstanding the science of brain injury.
We therefore urge the authors to retract their paper.
In the end, Dr. Romano's paper was not retracted. And now Romano had another case. A second Steeler had died.
Terry Long committed suicide by drinking antifreeze.
And Dr. Romano received his brain.
I came to work one morning, and everybody else said, "Hey, we have another case for you." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Oh, Terry Long died." I'm like, "Who's Terry Long?" "Oh, he's another NFL player. He died."
Long was an offensive lineman with the Steelers for 8 years. He battled in the pit alongside Mike Webster.
He, like Webster, his life had sort of fallen apart in a lot of ways. He had issues certainly during his career.
He was a steroid user. He had been involved in some serious financial problems.
And so ultimately, he committed suicide by drinking antifreeze.
As he had for Webster, Dr. Romano sectioned part of Long's brain and again had it stained.
He ran the same test, same stains, found the same splotches. CTE in his brain too. Now, two former Steelers who had gone crazy about the same time.
When I saw Terry Long's case, I became more convinced that this was not just an anomaly, a statistical anomaly.
The NFL would not publicly sit down with Dr. Romano, but one night, in a private meeting, he brought his CTE slides and finally met face-to-face with one of the NFL's doctors.
And the NFL doctor at some point said to me, "Ben, do you know the implications of what you're doing?" So I looked, it was on my left. I said, "Yeah, I think I do." He said, "No, you don't." So we continued talking. At some point, he interrupted me again. "Ben, do you think you know the implications of what you're doing?" I said, I think I do. I don't know. He said, "No, you don't." So we continued talking again. Then the third time he interrupted me, and I talked to him. I said, "Okay, why don't you said if 10% of mothers in this country would begin to perceive football as a dangerous sport, that is the end of football.
In 2008, Dr. Ann McKee was a leading Alzheimer's researcher.
This is what I do. I look at brains, I'm fascinated by it. I can spend hours doing it. In fact, if I want to relax, that's one way.
One day, she received a phone call from Boston University Medical School.
I called her and said, "Are you interested in looking at the brains of former football players?" And she didn't drop a beat and said, "Are you kidding?" I had no idea that she was a super football fan.
I was born with football. My brothers, my dad. I played football when I was a kid. I mean, it's part of life. It's a part of growing up. It's a way of life. So I get it.
For Nowinski, the issue of CTE is personal. He worries he hasn't.
I'd be a fool not to worry about CTE personally. I took as much brain trauma as anyone. I think I have more than enough reason to believe that I'm fighting to be fighting this myself. I am fighting.
At Harvard, Nowinski was a punishing tackler. He suffered countless head injuries.
Nowinski, who is not a scientist, says there are people getting hit here. If we speak up now, we may be able to, if not save lives, at least prevent the damage that we are seeing on Anarchy's table.
Nowinski decided to take on the NFL in a very public way at their biggest event, the 2009 Super Bowl. That May, McKee and Nowinski arrived at NFL headquarters.
We head on up to a very, very fancy conference room. There's blue paneling, jerseys and trophies in the glass, and it was probably 15 members of the committee.
And one of the first things McKee notices is that there's only one other woman in the room, and it's not a doctor, it's a lawyer.
A lawyer is not there to offer medical advice, and a lawyer is not there to offer competitive athletic advice either. A lawyer is there to figure out what the league needs to do to defend itself against a storm that may or may not come, but the league has to be ready to fight.
I'm up against a lot of doubters. I'm up against people who don't think that any of this holds any water. So fine, I'm just going to show them what I have. And they kept interrupting.
Dr. Ira Casson and others on the committee expressed their skepticism that playing football was the cause of CTE.
Very, very quickly, she got serious pushback from Ira Casson and the rest of the committee.
At the same time, another force was also causing trouble for the NFL and the commissioner: the wives and widows of players with CTE.
I don't think anyone else but the wives, sisters, mothers, daughters, and Anne McKee could have forced this issue into American consciousness.
Goodell is asked point blank if he stands by the idea that concussions don't hurt pro football players.
Let me address your first question.
Can't answer.
You're obviously seeing a lot of data and a lot of information that our committees and others have presented with respect to the linkage. The medical experts should be the one to be able to continue that debate.
I just asked you a simple question. What's the answer?
The answer is the medical experts would know better than I would with respect to that.
His consistent response to questions was, I am not a scientist, and any questions about the long-term effects of concussion or head trauma in NFL players are better addressed to scientists.
Owen Thomas, to me, was a critical case. Here we have a 21-year-old who was a hard-hitting lineman from the age of 9 on.
And then, seemingly out of nowhere, he decided to take his own life. Never been diagnosed with a concussion, never had a problem in the world.
Owen Thomas had hanged himself in his off-campus apartment. Chris Nowinski secured his brain for Dr. McKee. Without any history of diagnosed concussions, it seemed unlikely he had CTE.
I was fully prepared to see nothing. I remember late at night looking at the brain and thinking, just gonna knock this one off.
advanced case of CTE had never been found in such a young person.
The human body is not created or built to play football. When you have force against force, you're going to have injuries. And I'm not talking about the knees and all of that stuff is a given. But from a neurological standpoint, you're going to have some brain trauma.
Harry Carson has been studying the matter since he retired 25 years ago.
Most people are keyed in on the big hit. But a little mini concussions are just as dangerous because you might be sustaining 6 to 10, maybe a dozen of these hits during the course of a game. And, if you're going up against top flight players who are able to perfect those skills of hitting you upside the head or, getting hit with an elbow, or it's one of those things that at some point you're going to pay for it down the line.
Back in the lab, McKee had seen another surprising case.
We had been able to get the brain of an 18-year-old who died 10 days after suffering his 4th concussion, playing high school sports.
It was the brain of 18-year-old Eric Pelly, a high school senior, a straight-A student. He'd played multiple sports. His dream was to play for the Steelers.
No one, I think, would have thought that you were going to find chronic traumatic encephalopathy in a high school athlete.
I was shocked to find that in the brain of his 18-year-old, there were little tiny spots, little tiny areas in the frontal lobe that looked just like this disease.
You have an 18-year-old with chronic traumatic encephalopathy that just shouldn't happen.
I had an 18-year-old at that time, and you know that brain is supposed to be pristine. The fact that it was there, and he was only playing high school level sports, I think that's a cause for concern.
For Dr. McKee and others, it raised the obvious question. How safe is it for children to play football?
From a physical risk standpoint, you know what you are doing when you sign your kid up, that he can hurt his knee, okay? But what you should know now is your child could develop a brain injury as a result of playing football. It's not just on the pro level, it's on every level of football. The question is, do you want it to be your child?
For Dr. McKee's colleague, Dr. Cantor, the controversial answer was that no one under 14 should play tackle football.
With what we know about the youth brain compared with the adult brain, that it's more easily disrupted than the adult brain. The youth brain is lighter in weight, so it has less inertia to put it in motion. So you tap a youth head whose brain moves much quicker than an adult brain that's heavier and therefore has more inertia.
Okay, well, bearing this very incisive and impressive documentary in mind, let's move into the panel. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Noble. He is an assistant professor of clinical neurology in the Department of Neurology, Columbia University Medical Center, and a faculty member of the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain. His academic and research training included internal medicine, neurology residency, including neurology chief resident and fellowship training in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry within the Department of Neurology at the Columbia University Medical Center. He received also a master's degree in epidemiology from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, with recognition of performance by receiving the Anna Gellman Award for Excellence in Epidemiology. He holds board certifications in neurology, behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry, and certification in public health, American Board of Public Health Examiners. Stemming from his background in training in neurology, behavioral neurology, and neuroepidemiology, he is developing a research program in concussions and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. In addition to providing expert care in Alzheimer's disease, he has an active practice of concussion care involving college and Olympic athletes and young adults facing concussion following injuries from football, lacrosse, basketball, soccer, across the sports scene. He is the principal investigator of a project studying a cohort of collegiate contact sport athletes, has helped develop a multidisciplinary collaborative research effort at Columbia University, and participates in Big Ten Ivy League CIC collaboration program in concussion research. He will address the genetic dimension and has many questions with regard to the long-term effects and of concussion, primarily concerning chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Noble.
Thank you, Ingrid, for having me tonight, and thanks to the panel. I've heard some great talks already. I hope to complement the things that you've heard already. Really focusing on what do we know from epidemiology that may inform our research tracks and where we can go to try to disentangle some of the problems that we've had in linking concussion and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I want to show a few pictures here about why we're here today. At your top left, you have Mike Webster, who you just saw a film about, and next to him is Terry Bradshaw, who was his quarterback, who sat behind and received the football for the same number of snaps that Mike Webster gave to Terry Bradshaw. He played in the same number of plays. Here they are at the NFL induction ceremony for the Hall of Fame. Webster was a few years before his death at this point and was thought to be quite disorganized in the speech that he gave. Bradshaw, on the other hand, as we know, commentates every Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon on major sports networks. A few other pictures here. I have here at the bottom right a famous individual who some of you may recognize, maybe others don't, but that's Babe Ruth and a concussion he had against the Washington Senators in 1924. And I show this picture because the way we manage concussion now is not a whole lot different than the way we managed concussion back in 1924. Babe Ruth was knocked out for about 5 minutes. He was then stood up, and he went back into the game that same inning, completed the game. Not only that, but he played the second game of a doubleheader that afternoon and was said to have hit a home run the following day. When Hillary Clinton was running for president in 2008, she said that if Henry Ford were alive today, he'd be embarrassed to open the hood of a Ford, realizing that the technology was not much different than the Model T that ran off his line back in the early 20th century. If you think about 90 years later, after the Babe had his concussion, the only thing different we do now, really fundamentally, is that we don't let him go back to play that same day. And then why haven't we talked about this before? This is a picture from Night at the Opera by the Marx Brothers. Well, why haven't we talked about concussion? Well, to some degree, it's been made fun of, it's been made light of, whether it be in the movies, Bugs Bunny cartoons that we all thankfully grew up with, but also some of the language that we use today. Getting your bell rung, seeing stars, taking a good lick. These are euphemisms for a traumatic brain injury, much in the way that spinal cord injury is referred to as a stinger, as I recently found out. Spinal cord injury likened to a bee sting. And then finally, why am I here today? In 2003, I met a football player at Columbia who walked into my office. I was a resident at the time. This is 2003. Concussion really wasn't on the public radar at that point. And I asked him why he was there today. He said he was having headaches. I said, what kind of headaches? He said, well, you know, padding up headaches. I said, I've never heard of a padding up headache. Tell me more. He says, well, you know, I'm getting headaches every time I put on my pads. And not knowing the answer to my next question, I said, well, what else are you doing the first day you put on your pads? He says, well, I'm taking hits. And I sat there thinking, my gosh, I bet this kid is having many, many concussive head injuries and doesn't even know it. I said, aren't you worried about this? He says, no, I don't have anything to worry about. I have these brain tests that the physicians are taking care of for me. I said, what do you mean brain tests? Turned out he was talking about automated neuropsychological testing that's been done at Columbia since 2000. So I kept that thought in mind for a few years through my residency. Now, as you heard Margot mention before, the Zurich definition of 2012 really is the standard by which we consider our definition of concussion at present. I don't know when the next concussion consensus is planned to be, but I suppose it's going to be at a time when we have really objective measures that may send us in the right direction. And maybe we're getting there closer than we think with this. But fundamentally, it involves a blow to the head, either direct or indirect, such that it causes an impulsive force on the head and thus the brain. It has a rapid onset of short-lived neurological function, resolves spontaneously. Now, it is short-lived, but some of these symptoms and some of these players can be affected for days, if not weeks, and some even months later. Why and who is going to get those lingering post-concussive symptoms remains a mystery, and perhaps is a point to look into in the research field. Some of the symptoms may, as I mentioned, resolve very quickly, though. Acute clinical symptoms largely reflect a functional disturbance rather than a structural injury. That was certainly the case in 2012, although I think there's some evidence now to suggest that there are real structural injuries that we can identify, at least in research protocols now. But fundamentally, there are no abnormalities found in standard structural neuroimaging studies, and that means something like a standard MRI that one would get. And the graded set of clinical symptoms may or may not involve loss of consciousness. This was a major fundamental shift in the way we think about concussion. There were these gradation symptom-based scales that we had before, but as Margot mentioned, every concussion is different from the other, and it need not have a certain level of consciousness that's affected or a certain duration to predict what the outcome is going to be. It's very hard to predict where it's going to go. Behind the symptoms of a concussion is what we call the pathophysiology. You see here, this is an image from a colleague of mine, Barclay Morrison, at Columbia, showing the torque forces that we think apply to a brain structure itself. This is not my work here, but fundamentally, and this is a very busy slide here, but what we can see here are the timelines here. We think that there are major metabolic disturbances that begin initially after the injury that last some days, if not maybe 6 or 7 days is where we typically think these major changes metabolically occur, and then it may be as long as 10 days before normal cerebral blood flow is restored within these areas. Not to say that there's necessarily a constriction of blood vessels to those areas, but it may relate to more the functional demand of those areas of the brain. This is from an NCAA study back in the early 2000s, and it looked at the symptomatology of concussions, those who had either overall concussions or moderate to severe. And I'm showing this to underscore, as Margot mentioned before, the relatively nebulous and sometimes nonspecific symptoms of concussion. Migraines are very common in the general public. Somewhere between 20% of patients in the general public have migraines. Most of them don't even know it. Headaches are very common after a concussion, and perhaps are more likely in those who have migraines in the past. Hasn't been studied, but I have to say, of the patients I see, there's a strong history of migraine in there. Balance and dizziness are common. Slowing down, this feeling of a brain fog is a common term we hear. Poor concentration, sensitivity to light or noise, and fatigue and drowsiness. These are really distinct symptoms for these players. Hard to distinguish for us, but fatigue and drowsiness are quite different for them. And then impaired memory or concentration. Here's some work I did at Columbia, where after thinking about those brain tests that the player that I met told me about, it turned out that he was talking about something called a headminder test. Now, headminder is somewhat of an equivalent of other products that are out there on the market, allowing for really an athletic trainer at the sideline to judge whether or not somebody is ready to return to play. Columbia's been doing these since 1999. The majority of these are since 2000. And this is the entirety of the data set of the players having had their first concussion in college. Many of them had concussions beforehand. Now, much like I imagine it is here, it's my first time at Princeton, but where I work, it's Lake Wobegon, right? Everybody's above average. And over here you have above average. This is their above average scores at baseline. Up in this corner over here, these are their baseline scores here. So on the y-axis, you see the baseline scores. And on the x-axis are actually their first or lowest, most often it's their first post-concussion testing. All of these players, it's worth noting, were thought to be asymptomatic at the time of their testing and were being considered to be ready to return to play. The standard use of these protocols usually has a threshold, in this case, 1 standard deviation below normal. This was a slightly different analysis that we did where I really summed up all the tests and looked at where these players landed. And you can see that some players were nearly 2 standard deviations below normal and certainly more than that from their baseline. So there are major fundamental changes that aren't so obvious, making the challenge of concussion and diagnosis even greater. But there may be some insights that we can learn into why people get concussions. So, and what are some ways that we can maybe reduce those risks? Here's a list of concussions among high school sports injuries. Now, these are of the injuries that occur within each individual sport, what proportion of them are concussion? We talk about football a lot. I was on the Brian Lehrer show a few months ago talking about cheerleading. Cheerleading is now a New York City sanctioned sport because it actually is one of the most common forms of injury among cheerleading. I was in the high school marching band when I was growing up in Atlanta, and I used to watch the cheerleaders on the sideline. These are not your average cheerleaders. These are the ones doing the pyramids and the flips up in the air and having major concussive injuries when they land, sometimes 2 and 3 stories below where they were thrown up to. These are major high-speed velocity impacts, not unlike a wide receiver catching a football at full speed and running into somebody. We can also maybe have some insights into the mechanisms of injury within each sport. Again, this is not my work, but I show it to demonstrate that we have perhaps different mechanisms within each sport, with football being principally player-to-player contact, whereas other sports may have a player to an implement, whether it be a stick, a ball, or perhaps a goal post. These are the kind of things that you can draw major insights from and perhaps improve the safety of these games. One of the fundamental things that we're probably aware of, where the consistency of AstroTurf has changed dramatically from being really just a layer of carpet over cement to having a rubberized surface beneath it. Certainly not the entire answer, but a long ways towards it. This is from a review we put together last year at Columbia, and it was hard trying to put together this graphic, but these are what I think are relatively comparable numbers for the number of concussions that occur in competitive athletic exposures. Now, athletic exposure is a single game or a single practice, and in this graphic, these are actually games. They are also drawn from an era where principally this was before the major concussion awareness campaigns began, as because the reason I had that is because there have been major changes in the incidences that are reported. I wanted to show an overall trend, and it seems as though youth-related concussions in youth-related football are at their highest in the age 8 to 12, with lower in high school, higher in college, and even higher in the NFL. Why is this remains a mystery, but there may be some attrition, natural attrition for children who aren't as strong, can't make it through, but there also is a suggestion that out here, this is a cumulative incidence of concussions and having longer lasting injuries. The graphic you see at the top right is from the National Geographic. This was an accelerometer that was worn by a single player at the University of North Carolina in a single season. The yellow bars indicate a 20 to 80 G hit, the red bars are an 80 G hit or higher, and the black bars, there are only 2, are concussions. All other, again, underscoring the difficulty in making a diagnosis of concussion and limiting the inference that we can draw from helmet accelerometry data that has become very popular. Just because somebody has a certain degree of force applied to the head doesn't mean that they're going to express a concussion. I'm working with ANGRET, and based upon these data, which are from some of our collaborators overseas, the first paper that came out looking at actually blood-based biomarkers of concussion was really in this paper up here. These were boxers, amateur boxers. So these are players who box 3 rounds at a time wearing helmets, padded helmets for what they're worth. And you could see that the boxers in their blood had a measurable substance, the same protein that's being implicated in CTE is high in the blood after having had a bout and returns back to normal several days later. In a similar article by the same group, they actually looked at about 30 hockey players, professional hockey players, and looked at the same blood protein, tau, in the blood. And you can see that there are certainly peaks among some players, but no changes in others. But it does seem to be the case that just like that graph I showed you among the young players, there seems to be a cumulative effect or some sort of intensity of response here, with the highest degree of concussion severity being associated with the highest level of blood tau. So as I said with the Zurich guidelines, we don't really have structural-based markers, and ANGRET's going to talk about this more with imaging, but I think we're getting there. This is something that's really been of great interest to me, and we're actually looking at this in the Columbia retired athletes. This was published 2 years ago now in Neurology, looking at the neurodegenerative cause of football players. All of these football players here played in the NFL for at least 3 years between 1959 and 1988, and died somewhere between 1997 and 2007. Now, it may not seem like a lot, but there were 17 deaths within that period of time, all of whom had a neurodegenerative cause. Now, keep in mind that the players at that time, in 2007 was the latest period of death, and the youngest age of birth in that group would have been around 1940. Okay, so you're looking at 67-year-olds, and 17 of that group of 3,000 people had a neurodegenerative cause of death, as proven by death certificate records. That ends up being about a 6-fold greater risk than the general public for various things, including dementia, ALS, otherwise known as Lou Gehrig's disease. We're looking at this in our own Columbia cohort, where ironically Lou Gehrig himself was a Columbia football Lion back in the 1930s. He would actually qualify for our study. The reason we talked at the beginning about why we're here is Mike Webster, and here's an example of Mike Webster's pathology. This is not his brain. But what we're all concerned about right now are these 4 stages that we've seen that Amniki has so eloquently described of the earliest stages of CTE, stage 1 and 2, with more advanced stages being 3 and 4. What remains a mystery is who expresses these and why. Is this degree of abnormality sufficient to cause a neurologic problem? If you draw inference from Alzheimer's disease or even stroke literature, there are many patients, even 30% of elders, who die with clinically indistinguishable Alzheimer's disease from those who have clinically apparent Alzheimer's disease. Moreover, about 5% of all people die with a stroke, 30% with neuropathologically proven stroke at the time of death, whereas only 5% of them have it at the time of life, sometime in the course of life. So the question remains, are these pathologies sufficient to cause clinically important changes? And this is a big Perhaps to that end, there have been some players who have participated in a study out of UCLA looking at tau tracers in the brain, trying to identify these tau proteins. What's a bit curious is that while these players, and we don't know what their pathologies look like at autopsy, there does seem to be a signal here in the temporal lobes where we'd expect to see their changes in CTE. Yet curiously, there's a large amount of it in the brainstem where we don't commonly typically see it. So we talked about some of the answered questions, or some of the answers we have already, but what are the unanswered questions? We are really in the infancy of understanding CTE and concussions, and here are some fundamental questions that the field is charged with answering. Number one, how often does concussion occur? We don't even know when it happens. Presently, every test that we have compares somebody's baseline with after having had a hit or a suspected hit. We don't even know if it's happening more than that, and we don't even know if it's happening in a subtle degree, if there's a detectable concussion below a concussion itself. What are the player-specific risks? Why does one player get it more often than another? Why does one player get it 5 times before they enter college versus 1? Why does one player take weeks to recover, whereas the others don't? They look clinically indistinguishable to us. Maybe there's something genetic that we're missing. Maybe there's something about a risk that we're missing as far as prior sports exposure. Why do people get them again? Can we identify players a priori before they even come into the contact sport itself? Would it be wise for us to think about figuring out who has that risk before they even engage in high school, collegiate, or NFL sports? What's the natural history of concussion? We don't even know that. How much is too much to keep playing? There's been a policy put forth recently of a hit count similar to a pitching count in baseball, which I still consider the national pastime. I forget who said NFL. Maybe it's going back there, I hope. Thank you. What are the long-term outcomes for collegiate athletes, for professional athletes, and then what treatments are available? We still have no treatments other than really rest and graduated return to activities. So finally, I showed you some pictures at the beginning. I want to show you some pictures at the end. I've been thinking about these 2 players. Now, all joking about the Mets' side. This is R.A. Dickey. Do you guys know who R.A. Dickey is? Anybody know? He's really the only knuckleballer in all of Major League Baseball. Most knuckleballers have the longest duration of pitching careers ever. Phil Niekro is one. He pitched into his 50s. And he actually began as a fastball pitcher out of the University of Tennessee. I went to Vanderbilt, so I'll let that slide. But he was from Tennessee. And this is a picture of him for the USA team, I believe in the 1996 Olympics, where I would have seen him actually pitch. I was in Atlanta at the time. And this is his arm that looked fundamentally different from all his other co-players' arms. And because of this picture, he ended up getting an MRI, which found he was congenitally missing a ligament in his arm, one that was thought to be fundamental to his career being successful. And he went from having a multi-$100,000 contract at the time he was signed with the Texas Rangers to having a $60,000 or $70,000 contract. Had this been known, maybe there would have been a different course. But thankfully, he managed to readapt himself from being a fastball to a knuckleball pitcher. And he now plays for the Toronto Blue Jays. And then over here is a very recent case that I think brings this case home as well. This is David Wilson, a New York Giant, who was recently deactivated, basically at early retirement. I believe he's 23 years old at the time, for having recurrent neck injuries, one of these stingers. And he, instead of fretting about this, I mean, certainly he's upset about this, but he actually had a very positive attitude. And his decision is to actually go back into training and jump in the triple jump in the Olympics as his goal in life, which he was very successful at when he came from Virginia Tech. So I think that there are examples. I was talking with an athletic trainer from a major school recently, and they said, you know, if you figure out who has a risk for having an injury before they get on the field, it puts one team at a competitive disadvantage over another. That player will just find another team that will let them play. But I think there's a great merit in trying to identify these players in advance so you can avoid potentially career-ending injury or potentially a life-threatening injury, spinal cord injury like this. And perhaps there's a way to find that for concussion too. All right, thanks for your time.
Well, thank you, James, for a wonderful talk and giving us a very panoramic view of this complexity. Just bear with me, I have to pull up my slide presentation and we'll talk about neuroimaging.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'd like to start off by asking a couple of questions. What are the most recent results from neuroimaging studies revealing about the effects of sports-related concussion in the brain? And what are the implications of these results? And in order to sort of get to the answers, let me just show you some of our data and results that we have in our population. So these, we studied 15 athletes who had a concussion in collaboration with University Health Services, with Margot's team. And we did an MRI 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months post-injury. And that was paralleled by the neuropsychological testing data. Obviously, we have baseline testing data, neuropsychological testing data on that as well. As you can see, there is a variety of sports involved, ranging from football to water polo. So it's not specifically football. It's on a diverse athletic, but varsity level, all of them are varsity level sports athletes. We had a control group of 15 subjects that are also varsity level athletes, but non-contact sports athletes. So one component of that imaging study was on functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's an advanced imaging technique when subjects perform a cognitive task, in this case, while we record their brain activation. And basically what it does is, very briefly, it measures changes in oxygenation in various brain areas. So the neurocognitive task that we used was the so-called NBAC task. I'm not going to go too much into it, but it is a task that has been tested before in normal subjects with regard to which brain areas are activated when subjects perform this task. And we were targeting the prefrontal cortex. For people who might not be in the field, it means it's the area of the brain where short-term memory is subserved. And we also wanted to pull in the parietal lobe, which has a function in spatial and letter processing, and wanted to see the frontoparietal network activation and how it might be altered in subjects who had suffered a concussion. So what you can see in these brain images is you have the red areas, and those represent where concussed subjects had significantly higher activation when they were performing this task as compared to their normal control subjects. And as you can see, it's in the prefrontal area, sort of in front of the brain, and it was exactly the area that had been demonstrated in normal population when they performed that same task. And in the top row, you can see that that was at the hyperactivation at 2 days, and then at 2 weeks and 2 months. And as you can see is that hyperactivation persists. It actually increases slightly at 2 weeks. We were very puzzled by these results. At first, when I looked with my postdoc, we were expecting a linear decrease as they recovered from, or as an expression of recovery after they had their concussion. And what we're thinking is that perhaps there might be a delayed stress reaction that is happening in the brain. We are thinking of maybe designing a new study where we would specifically look at that phenomenon. As you can see at 2 months, the hyperactivation is still there, but there are less brain areas, and I don't have the time to go into this, but the brain areas that were in addition activated, where they were hyperactivating, were much more numerous at 2 days and 2 weeks than at 2 months. But that prefrontal hyperactivation persists. So what does this tell us with regard to the recovery? So there's one issue. All of these athletes tested within normal range, neuropsychologically, with anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks. But the brain activation still seems to be abnormal or significantly different from normal control subjects. So our conclusion was that this study might reveal that neural recovery lags behind behaviorally assessed recovery. And that is one of those, that grayish area that we're confronting right now. We have these results in the advanced imaging techniques where we do group comparisons. We can not yet, because we don't have a gold standard yet. We're moving towards that. We hopefully will be there in the near future, where we could, a neuroradiologist could pull up this image and we could put a mask, measure the beta values in a certain area and say, like in a blood test, the values are not within normal range because we have a reference. So maybe this will help to solve this problem. Why are they testing normally? They're asymptomatic, but we do see persistent differences. When will they ever stop these? Will they ever go back to a comparable to normal activation? And we don't know. But the fact is they are functioning within normal range. Probably because it's such a mild injury, they can compensate. We also have on the same subjects, so just very briefly, and that I don't want to spend too much time on that, this is when we downloaded the average values of these areas that you see showing up in red where they hyperactivated, and then plotted them for the individual subjects. And what you can see, the blue line is where the normal control subjects were with regard to their activation, and the red lines are obviously the concussed subjects. As you can see, they're all obviously above the norm. And then you can see that trend where they hyperactivate more at 2 weeks, which is this sort of interesting result that we have. Might be they're concussed, they're dealing with an academic load, perhaps this is significant, indicative of some kind of stress reaction. What is very interesting is that after 2 weeks, the recovery is very variable. And that, I think, speaks to what Jamie just pointed out before. Perhaps there are different phenotypes and therefore are recovering differently. Some of them go up and might have a harder time to recover. Others recover and one of them goes back to sort of the normal range. And that's a question, again, that individual type of recovery pattern is a big puzzle, and perhaps genetic testing, once we have a phenotype, might shed some light. So we have on the same subjects the structural imaging, which is a different imaging technique. The subject does not perform a task. It measures when water molecules diffuse along the axons, the connections, the nerve fibers that connect one brain area with another in the brain. And it measures how well they keep their directionality or how freely they diffuse. There are different measures that DTI offers us. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into these technicalities, but basically the comparison that we did on the same sample of subjects, these 15 subjects that I showed you before, the functional data, was we constructed a so-called white matter skeleton, which is that thin green line that's on the center of the nerve fibers in the white matter of the brain, not the gray, the white matter where we have all the nerve fibers. And what we then do is we compare all the little squares on those nerve fibers with the individual with the same square of the normal brain, and then see whether we find any structural differences in these measures. And so here are the results for this that we've had after this when we did this comparison. Again, the area in red is where we found structural differences. It's an area which is located in sort of further back in the brain, where a lot of the large white matter fiber tracts, the large nerve fibers, cross and merge. It's the pathway, for instance, that goes down from the motor cortex to the spinal cord that controls movement. Then we have the anterior, posterior running fiber tracts that connect what we see to the and transports the information to the occipital lobe, where it's integrated and analyzed to make sense out what we see, etc. And probably we're surprised again is comparing all these voxels in the on that whole white matter skeleton that you can see, only that area fell out. And not only in one study, we did a subsequent study on a different sample, and we had exactly the same brain area that fell out, only on the other side, in the other hemisphere. So what we are thinking that perhaps this area of the brain, but we need to further substantiate it with a larger sample, obviously, could perhaps have potential for an imaging marker, in the sense that if it confirms itself that this area is at higher risk because of the underlying brain architecture of these fiber tracts that cross and merge, and hence maybe the shearing forces that act on the brain during a concussion might be more efficient, then we could create the mask that could go out into the clinic, because diffusion images can be taken clinically, could be superimposed, and if we could come up with what that value should look like in that area, and then if it's abnormal in a concussed individual, as we compare, because these values could be computationally very quickly calculated, this could perhaps become a diagnostic tool. But we are not there. We do need to further substantiate it with a much larger sample. So again, we downloaded the values of that red area where we saw structural differences and plotted it for each individual subject. And what we can see, the values, they go down, and that means they get better. I mean, it's indicative of recovery. The structural integrity is higher, so at 2 weeks after injury. And then most of them do go back to play. They're clinically asymptomatic neuropsych, and that's what is used right now clinically to evaluate them, which is the best available. But what we see structurally, they kind of get there's a trend. It's a trend that they again move towards a worsening, or the values go back, being indicative that there might be something structurally happening. This could be possible, or might be possible. We would have to look into this further, because they are again exposed to subconcussive hits, and that is a big question. Again, Marco has mentioned that, and so has James. We don't know what these subconcussive hits do. We have certainly our concerns about them. Obviously, the question is, and what this indicates to, how should we go about the return to play? And that's a whole other, obviously, big issue. And do these preliminary or these imaging results that we have so far indicate that perhaps the return to play should be extended somewhat, even if they test neuropsychologically normal? This is a very difficult question. But definitely there's something happening, and again, what you can see, the individual differences are large. Oops, is that not reacting? Sorry. It's hanging. Finally, we did another analysis, or an additional analysis. We took that mask of the area where we had these structural differences and masked that out and took all the rest of the white matter to see whether we saw similar trends in what we saw in that area where we had the significant differences. And indeed, as you can see, there is a similar trend. They get better and then slightly worse. And that's in the remaining areas of the white matter, which nothing came out significant in when we did the between group comparison. And so what this shows is that even though we didn't have significance, but the same trend exists in the remaining white matter. And that's quite an important finding, which we should pursue probably as well. So the conclusions are that these imaging results provide evidence for structural and functional alterations in the brain after sports-related concussion, extending up to 2 months post-injury. DTI in particular is a promising imaging tool which provides a scientific basis for the definition of sports-related concussion. I think that's where DTI might be able to really make a contribution, that it is a more objective tool that could help with understanding better what is actually a concussion and what are the various grades and shades of concussion. And it might be calling for a modification of the existing definition of concussion as stated in the Zurich consensus statement, where it is still stated that there are no structural differences, granted that we can see on regular clinical MRIs. But I think we have now, and it's not only my group that has shown that, there are other studies out there that show the same trends, that perhaps this should be modified. The study also provides preliminary evidence for persistent structural DIA and functional changes in the brain after sports-related concussion, and as I mentioned already before, indicates that neural recovery lags behind behaviorally assessed recovery. So what are the implications? Again, as I mentioned already, this might sort of indicate that perhaps the definition of concussive injury should be modified. Also, it definitely might add some perspectives that could start to be taken into consideration for the criteria for return to play, even though we don't yet have an imaging marker. Do we have to wait until we have an imaging marker? Why not, since there is this evidence out there, perhaps pull it in? It's obviously very important to define genetic high-risk markers for a phenotype at high risk for this type of injury and prolonged recovery. And ideally, combined studies. It calls for combined studies of these assessing these genetic risk markers with imaging. And then the brain measures could be correlated, which might in the future perhaps be helpful for diagnosis. We need to, certainly there's a lot of effort going on in finding a threshold for CTE. When can we see something in the brain that might be indicative for chronic traumatic encephalopathy? And that's a long call. That will take a long time. But I think this, again, would be a very important factor and should be pursued. And then obviously, finally, what are the economic and health policy implications of that? MRIs are very expensive, and can we ever imagine that we would do an MRI for every concussion? Certainly not, but perhaps in the cases that tend, if we can identify the cases that might be at high risk for prolonged recovery, for instance, with a genetic marker combined, then a MRI would be indicated. So thank you for your attention. And